December 1941. The night air across Nazi-occupied Belgium carried more than winter's chill. It carried the sound of boots on cobblestone, the echo of orders barked in German, and the desperate whispers of families who knew their time was running out. But on a forgotten rail line cutting through the frozen countryside, something impossible was happening. Their passenger train, scheduled for routine service between Brussels and the French border, had become something else entirely. Its conductor, a 38-year-old railway worker named Henri Baudart, wasn't transporting paying customers that night. Hidden beneath false floors, crammed into modified luggage compartments, and pressed against the walls of hollowed-out coal bins, were 47 Jewish refugees, men, women, and children, all betting their lives on the belief that this ordinary machinista would get them across the border before dawn. What the Gestapo didn't know, what even Baudart's own railway supervisors couldn't have suspected, was that this wasn't his first run. It was his 23rd. Henri Baudart wasn't supposed to be a hero. Born in the industrial heart of Liège to a family of metalworkers, he'd spent his entire adult life doing exactly what the railway company told him to do: keep schedules, follow protocols, and never ask questions about cargo or passengers. Before the occupation, his biggest concern was whether the morning express would arrive on time at Gare du Midi. He had a wife, 2 daughters, and a modest apartment that overlooked the rail yards. He read the newspaper at breakfast, attended Mass on Sundays, and had never broken a serious rule in his life. But the German invasion of May 1940 had rewritten the rules for everyone. Within months, the roundups began. Jewish families who'd lived in Belgium for generations, shopkeepers, teachers, physicians, were pulled from their homes in the middle of the night. The transit camps filled. The trains heading east, the ones Baudart wasn't allowed to operate, began their regular departures. And Henri Baudart, the man who'd never questioned an order, started asking himself a question that would change everything. What good is following the rules when the rules themselves have become evil? The transformation of his passenger train into a mobile sanctuary didn't happen overnight. It began in August 1941 when a former colleague, a track maintenance worker named Albert Marquet, approached Baudart with a proposition that could get them both executed. Marquet had connections with a resistance network operating out of Brussels, a loose coalition of priests, university students, and former military officers who were moving Jewish families toward neutral Switzerland and unoccupied France. But they had a problem. The Germans had locked down the roads. Checkpoints appeared every 15 kilometers. Travel permits were scrutinized with murderous attention to detail. But the trains, the regular passenger trains that kept Belgium's wartime economy functioning, those still moved with relative freedom. Marquet needed someone with access, someone with authority, someone the German rail inspectors wouldn't suspect. He needed Henri Baudart. The Machinista's first response was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd built his life on stability and caution. Absolutely not. The risk wasn't just to himself, it was to his family, to everyone who worked his line, to every passenger who trusted him to get them safely from point A to point B. But Marquet had brought something with him that night, something he knew would break through Baudart's fear. Photographs. 12 pictures of children, none older than 10, all wearing the yellow stars the Germans had mandated 3 months earlier. None of them, Marquet explained quietly, would be alive by winter, unless someone did something. Baudart's first run happened on a rain-soaked night in September. Just 5 passengers, an elderly couple and their 3 grandchildren, hidden in a modified baggage car that Baudart and Marquet had spent 2 weeks preparing in secret. The Machinista's hands shook so violently on the throttle that he could barely maintain speed. Every station they passed, every German uniform he glimpsed through the rain-streaked windows, felt like the moment his life would end. But they made it. Across the border into unoccupied France, where resistance contacts were waiting in the pre-dawn darkness to spirit the family away to safety. And Henri Baudart, the rule follower, the man who'd never taken a risk in his life, realized something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He could do this again. Over the next 3 months, the operation expanded with desperate speed. Marquet's resistance network began routing more families to Baudart's line. The modifications to the train grew more sophisticated. false compartments built into the coal tender, hollowed sections beneath passenger seats, even a modified water tank that could hold 2 adults if they could control their breathing and endure the cold. Bodart recruited 2 trusted colleagues, both railway workers who'd lost family members to the German camps, and together they created a system. Regular passengers occupied the visible cars, completely unaware of the human cargo traveling inches beneath their feet. Bodart memorized the schedules of German rail inspections, learned which border guards could be bribed with black market cigarettes, and developed a 6th sense for when a routine stop was about to become a search. The number of refugees per run increased, 8, then 12, then 20. By December, Bodart was moving between 30 and 50 people every 10 days, a rolling act of defiance that would earn him a bullet to the head if the Gestapo ever discovered the truth. But the Gestapo was getting suspicious. Informants had reported unusual activity around the Brussels rail yards. German intelligence had noted a statistical anomaly. Too many Jewish families were disappearing from their assigned districts, vanishing without the paper trail that deportation created. Someone, somewhere, was running an underground railroad, and the Nazi security apparatus was determined to find it. On the night of December 18, 1941, as Henry Bodart prepared for what he thought would be a routine run across the Belgian border, German counterintelligence was preparing something else, a trap. And 47 refugees, pressed into the darkness of his modified train, were about to discover whether an ordinary machinista's courage could survive the ultimate test. The trap was set at Kortrijk station, 23 kilometers from the French border. German military intelligence, working with the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Division, had spent 2 weeks analyzing rail traffic patterns and had identified Bodart's route as statistically suspicious. Too many of his scheduled runs happened at night. Too many occurred during shift changes when skeleton crews staffed the border checkpoints. And most damning of all, too many of his trains experienced minor mechanical delays at precisely the points where German inspectors were most active, only to resume normal speed once they'd passed into less monitored territory. The Germans didn't have proof yet, but they had something almost as useful: pattern recognition. So they modified the pattern. On December 18th, without advance warning to railway personnel, a new inspection protocol was implemented. Every passenger train crossing into France would undergo a complete search at Kortrijk. Not just documents, but physical inspection of every compartment, every luggage area, every space large enough to conceal a human being. And to ensure compliance, they'd stationed 30 Wehrmacht soldiers on the platform, backed by 2 Gestapo officers and a mechanical engineer whose sole job was to examine the train's structure for modifications. Henri Bodart learned about the new protocol exactly 8 minutes before his scheduled departure from Brussels. A sympathetic railway dispatcher, a man who suspected what Bodart was doing but had never asked directly, pulled him aside near the locomotive and delivered the news in a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. Full inspection at Kortrijk, structural examination, no exceptions. The dispatcher's eyes held a terrible question: what are you going to do? Bodart felt his stomach turn to ice. 47 people were already aboard, already hidden in spaces that would be obvious to anyone conducting a thorough search. The false floor in car 3 would reveal itself the moment an inspector started tapping for hollow spaces. The modified coal bins wouldn't withstand scrutiny from a mechanical engineer. And the water tank, the water tank where 2 young brothers were currently pressed against freezing metal, would be discovered within seconds. Bodart had 3 choices, and all of them were variations of catastrophe. He could abort the run, pull everyone off the train and scatter them back into Brussels, where German patrols were already conducting nightly sweeps. He could attempt the crossing anyway, and pray for a miracle that his experience told him wouldn't come. Or he could do something that had never been part of the plan, something that would either save 47 lives or end them all in a hail of German bullets. He chose option 4, a possibility so insane that it hadn't occurred to him until that exact moment. He would bypass Kortrijk entirely. The main rail line required passage through the station. German engineering had ensured there was no legitimate way around it. But Bodart had worked these routes for 17 years. He knew something the Germans didn't: 3 kilometers before Kortrijk, there was an abandoned spur line, a relic from Belgium's pre-war industrial expansion that had been decommissioned in 1938. The tracks were old, possibly unstable, definitely not rated for passenger service. The route would take them through a section of countryside where German patrols rarely ventured because there was nothing there worth guarding. And if the intelligence was right, if the maps Marquet had shown him months ago were accurate, the abandoned line reconnected with the main route to France roughly 8 kilometers past Kortrijk, well beyond the new inspection point. It was insane. The tracks might not hold. The Germans might have pickets along the route. And even if everything went perfectly, the deviation would be noticed immediately, triggering an alert that would bring every available German unit down on their position within the hour. Bodart made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. He climbed into the locomotive, signaled the all-clear to his 2 accomplices in the rear cars, and pulled the departure lever. The train lurched forward into the December night, its headlamp cutting through fog that had settled over the Belgian countryside like a burial shroud. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded normally. They passed through the outer Brussels checkpoints without incident, their papers in order, their manifest showing nothing unusual. But as the lights of Kortrijk began to glow on the horizon, Bodart did something that would be reported in German military logs as either mechanical failure or deliberate sabotage. He killed the train's running lights, reduced speed to barely 15 kilometers per hour, and guided his locomotive onto tracks that officially no longer existed. In the passenger cars, regular travelers assumed they were experiencing a routine slowdown. But in the hidden compartments, 47 refugees felt the change in the trackbed and understood that something had gone terribly wrong, or terribly right. The abandoned spur line was worse than Bodart had feared. Decades of neglect had left the rails warped and overgrown with vegetation that scraped against the undercarriage with sounds like skeletal fingers. The train's reduced speed was the only thing preventing a derailment as they navigated curves that hadn't been maintained since before the war. Behind them, exactly 11 minutes after they'd failed to appear at Kortrijk station, German military radio traffic exploded with urgent communications. A train had vanished, search protocols were activated, and somewhere in the December darkness, Henri Bodart, a machinista who'd never broken a rule in his life, was now Belgium's most wanted criminal, shepherding 47 souls through the night on a prayer, a gamble, and tracks that might collapse at any moment. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 20 minutes of Bodart's disappearance from the Kortrijk checkpoint, Wehrmacht Command had mobilized 4 motorized infantry units, dispatched reconnaissance motorcycles along every secondary road paralleling the rail lines, and ordered searchlights positioned at every known crossing point between Belgium and France. Radio operators transmitted alerts to border stations from Tournai to Mouscron, warning of a rogue train carrying unknown cargo and operated by a conductor, now classified as an enemy of the Reich. Gestapo headquarters in Brussels issued shoot-on-sight orders for Henri Bodart and authorized field commanders to stop the train by any means necessary, including artillery if required. The Germans knew something catastrophic was happening. You didn't abandon your scheduled route and vanish into the Belgian countryside unless you were transporting something worth dying for. What they didn't know, what their meticulous intelligence gathering had failed to uncover, was the exact nature of that cargo. But they would find out soon enough, because the abandoned spur line that Bodart was navigating with white-knuckled desperation was leading him directly toward the one thing he couldn't avoid, a crossing point where German forces were already assembling. Inside the hidden compartments, the 47 refugees experienced the detour as a descent into mechanical hell. The violent shaking of the deteriorating trackbed threw bodies against metal walls. Children who'd been instructed to remain absolutely silent began to whimper as the G-forces of unbanked curves pressed them against their parents. In the modified water tank, the 2 young brothers Bodart had worried about were being subjected to temperatures that had dropped below freezing, their bodies going numb as condensation from their breathing created ice crystals on the metal inches from their faces. An elderly woman hidden beneath the false floor of car 3 had broken her wrist when a particularly violent lurch threw her against a support beam, and she was biting down on her coat sleeve to keep from screaming. But they stayed quiet. They stayed hidden. Because every single person in those compartments understood the mathematics of their situation with terrible clarity. If they were discovered, they would be shot where they stood. There would be no arrest, no deportation, no camp. The Germans had made clear in a dozen occupied territories what happened to Jews who tried to escape: immediate execution, public display of the bodies, and retribution against anyone who'd helped them. So they endured the cold, the pain, the suffocating darkness, and they trusted that the machinista who'd gotten them this far knew what he was doing. But Bodart was operating on faith, not knowledge. The maps Marquet had shown him were from 1936, before the decommissioning, and they offered no information about the current state of the infrastructure. Every kilometer of track could be the one where the rails finally gave way, sending 9 cars of human cargo tumbling down an embankment. Worse, he had no way of knowing whether the reconnection point to the main line still existed. German occupation forces had torn up secondary rail throughout Belgium to salvage steel for the war effort. If they'd removed the junction switches that would allow him to transition back onto the main route, he'd be trapped on a dead-end spur with no reverse options and German search teams closing in from every direction. His 2 accomplices, positioned in the rear cars to maintain the illusion of normal operations for any regular passengers, had no idea what was happening. They couldn't radio forward without risking interception by German signals intelligence. All they could do was watch the darkness fly past and wonder whether their conductor had lost his mind or was executing some desperate last-minute plan. The junction appeared out of the fog like salvation wrapped in rust. 8 kilometers past Kortrijk, exactly where the old maps had promised, the abandoned spur curved back toward the main line. But the switches that would allow transition between tracks were locked in the closed position, secured with chains and a padlock that looked military-grade. Bodart had perhaps 90 seconds before he'd be forced to emergency brake or crash through the junction at speed that would almost certainly cause a derailment. He slammed the train into the hardest deceleration the locomotive could manage without jackknifing the cars, feeling the momentum of hundreds of tons of steel fighting against brake pads that began smoking immediately. In the hidden compartments, refugees were thrown forward, bodies piling against bulkheads, fresh injuries adding to the collection of broken bones and bruises. The train shuddered to a stop approximately 50 meters from the locked junction, its headlamp still extinguished, pointing toward a barrier that stood between them and possible escape. And Henri Bodart, his hands shaking with adrenaline and terror, did something that would later seem either divinely inspired or criminally reckless. He grabbed a fire axe from the locomotive's emergency kit and ran toward the junction in the darkness. 45 seconds. That's how long it took Bodart to reach the switches, assess the lock, and begin attacking the chain with blows that sent sparks into the December night. Each strike of the axe rang out like a bell, announcing his position to anyone within a kilometer. Behind him, the train sat dark and vulnerable, a stationary target filled with witnesses to his treason. Ahead, somewhere in the fog, German patrols were methodically sweeping every meter of countryside. The chain held for 3 strikes, 4-5. On the 6th blow, with Bodart's shoulders screaming and his breath coming in ragged gasps, the lock shattered. He threw the switches by hand, feeling decades-old mechanisms grind reluctantly into position, and sprinted back to the locomotive. 60 seconds later, the train was moving again, transitioning from dead track to active rail, accelerating toward the French border with German radio traffic crackling through the night behind them. They were 8 kilometers past the Kortrijk checkpoint, running dark through occupied territory, and absolutely everything depended on the next 20 minutes. The French border was still 17 kilometers away, but the landscape between Bodart's position and safety had transformed into a gauntlet of German military infrastructure that hadn't existed on his previous runs. Wehrmacht occupation forces had spent the past 6 weeks fortifying the frontier in response to increasing resistance activity. What used to be a sleepy agricultural border with minimal checkpoints had become a militarized zone featuring guard towers every 3 kilometers, mechanized patrols with mounted searchlights, and communication lines that could summon reinforcements within minutes. Bodart knew none of this. His intelligence was weeks old, his maps outdated, and his assumption that he could simply power through to France the way he'd done 22 times before was about to collide with the reality that the German High Command had specifically engineered to prevent exactly what he was attempting. The train was now running at nearly full speed, its darkened cars cutting through fog that provided cover, but also prevented Bodart from seeing obstacles until they were nearly on top of them. In the locomotive cab, he made a calculation that would determine whether 47 people lived or died, maintain maximum speed, and risk running into a prepared German position, or slow down and give the pursuing forces time to catch up from behind. He chose speed. It was the wrong choice. The first German position appeared 3 kilometers later, a hastily erected checkpoint where the rail line crossed a minor road. 2 trucks were parked perpendicular to the tracks, their headlights creating a wall of illumination that turned night into day. Bodart saw them too late to stop, too late to even significantly reduce speed. He had perhaps 8 seconds to make a decision that a military strategist would have needed 8 hours to properly evaluate. The trucks weren't blocking the tracks themselves, just positioned to illuminate anything that passed, which meant they were observation posts, not barriers. But observation posts implied soldiers, and soldiers implied weapons, and weapons trained on a train that was clearly violating every protocol meant certain death for everyone aboard. Bodart did the only thing his panicked mind could conceive. He opened the throttle wider, pushed the locomotive to speeds that passenger cars were never designed to sustain, and aimed his train directly at the gap between the German trucks. The soldiers stationed at the checkpoint, expecting routine traffic or possibly no traffic at all, processed what they were seeing with the kind of delayed reaction that comes from absolute surprise. Their darkened train, running without authorization, approaching at suicidal speed through a border zone under total German control, it was so far outside their operational expectations that several crucial seconds elapsed before anyone thought to raise a weapon. The train screamed through the checkpoint at 87 kilometers per hour, its passage creating a blast of wind and noise that sent loose equipment flying and forced the German soldiers to dive for cover. Rifle fire erupted immediately after, muzzle flashes creating strobing light in the fog, as bullets ricocheted off the train's metal skin. In the passenger cars, regular travelers who'd been dozing or reading suddenly found themselves in a combat zone, screaming and throwing themselves to the floor as rounds punched through windows and embedded in seat cushions. But in the hidden compartments, the 47 refugees stayed frozen and silent, even as bullets passed within inches of their concealed positions. A round pierced the modified water tank, creating a high-pressure spray that soaked the 2 young brothers hiding inside, but they made no sound. Another bullet tore through the false floor in car 3, missing the elderly woman with the broken wrist by less than a hand's width, and she bit down harder on her coat sleeve until she tasted blood. The German soldiers at the checkpoint, recovering from their initial shock, were already on their radio reporting an enemy train breaching the border security zone. Every German unit between Bodart's current position and France now had exact coordinates, exact heading, and authorization to destroy the train by any means available. Bodart's locomotive emerged from the checkpoint with 3 bullet holes in the boiler housing, a shattered side window that sent freezing air screaming through the cab, and a fuel line that was leaking at a rate that would become critical within the hour. But the train was still moving, still accelerating, and the French border was now less than 14 kilometers away. The problem was that those 14 kilometers contained 2 more checkpoint positions that would be fully alerted and prepared for his arrival, plus an unknown number of mobile patrol units that were already being vectored to intercept. German military efficiency, the same ruthless organizational capacity that had conquered most of Europe, was now focused entirely on stopping one Belgian machinista and his cargo of ghosts. Radio communications filled the airwaves with coordinates and tactical updates. A mechanized patrol equipped with a 20mm anti-aircraft gun was racing to reach an overpass that crossed the rail line 9 kilometers ahead, a position from which they could fire directly down onto the train with weapons designed to destroy aircraft. Wehrmacht Command was also diverting 2 spotter planes from a nearby airfield, despite the fog, with orders to locate the train and direct ground forces to its position. And at the final checkpoint before France, German engineers were doing something that would turn the border crossing into a killing field. They were preparing to demolish the bridge. The mathematics of pursuit had become brutally simple. Baudard needed approximately 14 more minutes to reach France. The German mechanized patrol would reach the overpass intercept point in approximately 11 minutes. The spotter planes would be airborne in approximately 7 minutes, and the demolition team at the border bridge would have their explosives in place in approximately 9 minutes. Henri Baudard, a railway worker who'd spent his entire career following schedules and procedures, was now in a race where every variable was controlled by an enemy force that had never lost a tactical engagement on Belgian soil. His only advantages were the fog, which grounded aerial reconnaissance, the speed of his locomotive, which was being pushed beyond its design tolerances, and something the Germans couldn't quantify or predict: the absolute refusal of an ordinary man to surrender 47 lives to an evil he could no longer tolerate. The border was 13 kilometers away. The pursuing German units were closing from 3 directions. And Henri Baudard's train, running dark through the occupied night, was about to discover whether courage and desperation could overcome superior force. The overpass appeared in Baudard's headlamp beam exactly when German tactical planning said it would. 9 kilometers from the French border, spanning the rail line at a height that provided perfect firing position for the 20mm anti-aircraft gun that was, at that precise moment, being positioned by a Wehrmacht mechanized unit that had arrived 40 seconds earlier. The German gunner, a veteran of the France campaign who downed 3 Allied aircraft over Sedan, was calibrating his weapon for a target that couldn't maneuver, couldn't return fire, and was approaching at a speed that made trajectory calculation almost trivial. His commanding officer had given explicit orders: disable the locomotive, stop the train, and secure all personnel aboard for interrogation. The Gestapo wanted prisoners who could be interrogated about resistance networks, but the gunner, watching through his sight as the darkened train emerged from the fog, made a battlefield decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He aimed for the locomotive's boiler, not to disable, to destroy, because something in his combat-trained instincts told him that whatever was on that train was important enough to die for, which made it important enough to kill for. His finger tightened on the trigger as the locomotive entered optimal range. What saved Henri Baudard's life in that moment wasn't skill or planning. It was a mechanical failure that occurred at the exact instant the German gunner fired. The leaking fuel line that had been damaged at the first checkpoint finally gave way completely, causing the locomotive to experience a sudden loss of power that reduced speed by nearly 20 kilometers per hour in less than 3 seconds. The 20mm rounds, calculated for a target moving at full speed, screamed through the space where the locomotive's boiler would have been, and instead impacted the coupling between the locomotive and the first passenger car. The explosion was devastating. The coupling shattered, sending shrapnel in every direction and severing the connection that held 9 cars of passengers to their engine. Baudard felt the sudden loss of weight behind him, felt his locomotive lurch forward as tons of drag simply disappeared, and understood with horrible clarity what had just happened. His train, the mobile sanctuary that carried 47 hidden refugees and approximately 30 regular passengers, had just been cut loose. The passenger cars, no longer powered, no longer controlled, were now rolling backward down a slight grade, gathering speed as gravity took over, heading directly back toward the pursuing German forces. In Car 3, where most of the refugees were hidden beneath false floors and in modified compartments, the sudden reversal of direction created immediate panic. People who'd stayed silent through bullets and cold and crushing fear began to break. Children started crying. Adults whispered urgent prayers in Yiddish and French and Dutch. The 2 accomplices Baudard had recruited, positioned in the rear cars, understood they had perhaps 2 minutes before the rolling cars either collided with pursuing German vehicles or derailed on a curve they were now taking backward at increasing speed. One of them, a railway mechanic named François Dumont, made a decision that would save most of the lives aboard. He fought his way to the manual brake system, a mechanical apparatus that required 2 grown men to operate effectively, and began applying pressure that would slow the runaway cars. The shriek of metal on metal was loud enough to wake the dead, loud enough to alert every German unit within a kilometer, but it was working. The backward roll began to slow. 30 kilometers per hour, 25, 20, but they were still moving in the wrong direction, away from France, toward capture. Meanwhile, Bodart's severed locomotive, suddenly freed from the weight of 9 passenger cars, was accelerating beyond anything he could control. The damaged fuel line meant he couldn't regulate power. The loss of the cars meant he'd lost the distributed braking system. And the downgrade track ahead meant gravity was working against him just as it had worked against the separated cars. His locomotive was becoming a runaway missile aimed at the French border, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The irony was crushing. He'd spent 23 runs carefully shepherding refugees to safety, and now when it mattered most, he was being torn away from the very people he'd risked everything to protect. Through the shattered side window, he could see the glow of the German checkpoint ahead, the final barrier before France, where engineers were frantically working to place demolition charges on the bridge supports. They'd heard the explosion at the overpass. They knew something catastrophic was happening, and they were preparing to bring down the only crossing point for 30 kilometers in either direction. If Bodart's locomotive reached that bridge before the demolition was complete, he might make it to France. But the 47 refugees in the cars behind him, now being manually braked to a halt by his accomplices, would be captured within minutes. The decision tree had collapsed to a single terrible choice. Bodart could stay with his runaway locomotive, possibly reach France alive, and abandon everyone he'd tried to save. Or he could do something that violated every safety protocol he'd ever learned, something that would almost certainly kill him, but might give the separated cars enough time to figure out their own escape. He looked at the throttle, at the damaged fuel line spraying volatile liquid across hot metal, at the bridge growing larger in his field of vision. Then Henri Bodart, the rule follower who'd become a revolutionary, made his final decision as a machinista. He tied down the throttle at full power, opened the firebox to maximum burn, wedged the dead man switch with a piece of broken window frame, and jumped from a locomotive moving at nearly 100 kilometers per hour into the December darkness. His body hit the embankment with force that shattered his left leg and 3 ribs, and consciousness left him before he finished rolling. Behind him, his driverless locomotive screamed toward the border bridge at suicidal speed, a projectile of steel and steam that was about to teach the Germans a lesson about unintended consequences. The driverless locomotive hit the border bridge at 107 kilometers per hour, exactly 32 seconds before the German demolition team finished placing their charges. The impact was cataclysmic. 60 tons of steel and superheated steam, traveling at a speed that transformed kinetic energy into something resembling an artillery strike, collided with bridge supports that were designed for controlled weight distribution, not ballistic force. The locomotive didn't simply derail, it exploded. The compromised boiler, already damaged from gunfire and leaking fuel, ruptured on impact with a detonation that sent shrapnel across a 100-meter radius. Fragments of the engine block tore through the German engineers working beneath the bridge, killing 3 instantly and wounding 4 others so severely they'd never return to duty. The bridge itself, weakened by the concussive force and now engulfed in flames from ignited fuel, began a structural collapse that the demolition charges had been meant to create in a controlled fashion. Instead, the collapse was chaotic, catastrophic, and complete. Within 90 seconds, the primary crossing point between occupied Belgium and Vichy France had been transformed into a burning crater that would require months to rebuild. And the German forces pursuing Bodart's train suddenly faced an operational nightmare. Their target had just destroyed the very choke point they'd been relying on to trap it. 8 kilometers behind the burning bridge, in the passenger cars that had been severed from Bodart's locomotive, François Dumont and his fellow accomplice had managed to brake the backward-rolling train to a complete stop. They were now stationary in the middle of occupied territory, surrounded by German patrols that were converging from multiple directions, with no locomotive to pull them forward and no clear path to safety. Radio chatter in German filled the air, Wehrmacht units reporting the bridge explosion, requesting medical evacuation for wounded personnel, and demanding instructions on how to proceed with the rogue train that had somehow orchestrated a disaster. Inside the hidden compartments, 47 refugees waited in darkness that had become suffocating. The elderly woman with the broken wrist had lost consciousness from pain and shock. The two young brothers in the water tank were showing signs of hypothermia, their lips blue, their shivering uncontrollable. And every single person crammed into those secret spaces understood that discovery was now inevitable. The Germans would search the train car by car, compartment by compartment, and this time there would be no escape, no last-minute miracle, no heroic conductor to save them. Some of the refugees began whispering final prayers. Others held their children and tried to provide comfort in what they believed were the last minutes of their lives. But François Dumont, the railway mechanic who'd applied the manual brakes, was experiencing a revelation born from watching the glow of the burning bridge light up the night sky. The German forces were in chaos. Radio discipline had broken down as units called for reinforcements, medical support, and clarification of orders. More importantly, the explosion had created a psychological effect that Dumont recognized from his own military service in the First World War. The Germans thought they were under attack. The destruction of the bridge, the casualties among their engineering team, the sheer audacity of a civilian train causing this level of damage, it had triggered defensive protocols. Wehrmacht units were taking up perimeter positions, preparing for a resistance assault that wasn't coming. Roadblocks were being repositioned. Artillery was being brought forward to shell suspected resistance positions. And in all that tactical reorientation, in all that military focus on an imaginary external threat, the stationary train sitting on the tracks had temporarily become a secondary concern. Dumont realized they had perhaps 15 minutes, maybe 20 if they were lucky, before German attention returned to the question of what exactly that train had been carrying. 15 minutes to do something impossible. He gathered the 30 regular passengers, civilians who'd boarded in Brussels expecting routine travel, and had instead found themselves in a combat zone, and explained the situation with brutal honesty. Hidden in their train were 47 Jewish refugees attempting to escape to France. The conductor who'd been trying to save them had either died in the locomotive explosion or was somewhere in the darkness, injured and alone. German forces would search the train within minutes. Everyone aboard, refugees and regular passengers alike, would face interrogation, imprisonment, possibly execution as resistance sympathizers. But there was an option, a desperate gamble that required every person in those cars to become complicit in an act of mass deception. The refugees needed to disappear, not into hidden compartments that would be discovered, but into the landscape itself. And the regular passengers needed to provide the chaos that would make that disappearance possible. What Dumont was proposing was technically a civilian evacuation, but in reality, it was something far more dangerous. He was asking 30 innocent passengers to become accessories to the largest resistance escape operation attempted in occupied Belgium, knowing that if a single person refused, if anyone decided cooperation with the Germans was safer than defiance, everyone would die. The response came not in words, but in action. Regular passengers began pulling refugees from their hiding places, helping children out of cramped compartments, supporting the injured, wrapping coats around those suffering from hypothermia. The elderly woman with the broken wrist was carried by two Belgian businessmen who'd been traveling to a meeting they'd now never attend. The young brothers from the water tank were warmed by a grandmother who'd been visiting family and was now holding strangers' children against her body to stop their shaking. And François Dumont standing in the doorway of car 3, watching 77 people, refugees and rescuers alike, pour out of the train into the Belgian countryside, understood that Henri Baudard's greatest achievement wasn't the 23 successful runs he'd completed. It was this. He'd shown ordinary people that extraordinary courage was possible, that the rules could be broken, that evil could be resisted. Now those ordinary people were scattering into the fog, moving toward farmhouses and barns and root cellars that local resistance would help them locate, becoming ghosts in a landscape the Germans controlled but didn't truly own. The train sat empty and silent as German patrols finally arrived, finding nothing but abandoned cars and a mystery they'd spent months trying to solve. Henry Bodart regained consciousness in a drainage ditch, approximately 40 meters from where he'd jumped from the locomotive. His body broken, but his mind sharp enough to understand that staying still meant death. German patrols were sweeping the area methodically, flashlights cutting through fog, as soldiers searched for survivors of what they now believed was a coordinated resistance attack. Bodart's left leg was shattered below the knee, his ribs screamed with every breath, and he was fairly certain he had internal bleeding that would kill him within hours if he didn't receive medical attention. But medical attention meant German custody, which meant interrogation, which meant revealing the names of everyone who'd helped him across 23 runs. Marquet, Dumont, the safe house operators in France, the resistance coordinators in Brussels, the railway dispatchers who'd looked the other way. He knew approximately 40 names, and under Gestapo interrogation methods, he'd give up every single one of them. So Henri Bodart, barely conscious and bleeding into Belgian soil, began to crawl, not toward help, not toward the distant lights of farmhouses where he might find shelter, but away from the rail line, away from the patrols, deeper into the countryside where he could either escape or die without betraying anyone. The crawl lasted 3 hours and covered less than 200 meters. Every movement sent lightning bolts of agony through his broken leg. Twice he passed out from the pain, waking in darkness with no sense of how much time had elapsed or how far German search teams had progressed. He could hear them in the distance, dogs barking, officers shouting orders, the mechanical rumble of trucks repositioning along roads that paralleled his route. The fog that had provided cover all night was beginning to lift as dawn approached, and with visibility increasing, his chances of remaining undetected were approaching zero. By the time he reached a small grove of trees near an abandoned farm building, his clothing was soaked with blood, and his vision was tunneling. He pulled himself into the shadow of a collapsed barn wall, pressed his back against rotting wood, and prepared to die. He thought about his wife and daughters in Liège, who'd believed he was working normal railway shifts and had no idea their husband and father had become Belgium's most wanted fugitive. He thought about the 47 refugees he'd tried to save, wondering if any had made it to France, or if they'd all been captured when the cars were searched. And he thought about the moment Albert Marquet had shown him those 12 photographs of children, the moment that had transformed an ordinary machinista into something he'd never imagined becoming, someone willing to die for strangers. He didn't hear the approach of the person who saved his life. Shock and blood loss had reduced his awareness to a narrow cone of failing consciousness. So when a hand touched his shoulder, Bodart's first reaction was resignation. The Germans had found him, and now everyone he loved would pay the price for his resistance. But the voice that spoke in his ear wasn't German. It was French, accented with the particular dialect of the Belgian-French borderlands, and it was saying words that didn't make immediate sense. "The priest sent me. We need to move you now." The speaker was a woman, perhaps 50 years old, dressed in farmer's clothing and carrying a medical bag that suggested she had some training as a nurse or midwife. She worked with brutal efficiency, injecting Bodart with something that made the pain recede to manageable levels, splinting his leg with pieces of the barn wall and binding his ribs tight enough to allow shallow breathing. Then she did something that seemed medically insane. She forced him to stand, to put weight on his shattered leg, to walk. Not far, just 20 meters to where a hay cart waited, pulled by a single exhausted horse. But those 20 meters, accomplished through pharmaceutical courage and the woman's physical support, were enough to move Bodart from the German search perimeter to a vehicle that looked entirely civilian, entirely innocent, entirely forgettable. The woman, who never gave her name and never asked Bodart's, covered him with hay and empty grain sacks, positioning the load to look natural while providing enough airspace for him to breathe. Then she climbed onto the driver's seat and guided the horse onto a farm road that led away from the rail line, away from the burning bridge, away from the concentration of German forces. They passed 2 Wehrmacht checkpoints in the next hour. At both, the woman presented papers identifying her as a local farmer transporting winter feed, and at both, the German soldiers waved her through with barely a glance. The psychology was perfect. Who would suspect a middle-aged farm woman of harboring Belgium's most wanted fugitive? The cart's pace was agonizingly slow, perhaps 8 kilometers per hour, and every bump sent fresh waves of pain through Bodart's drugged haze. But slow was invisible, slow was forgettable. And slow, combined with the woman's unshakable calm and the German's focus on tracking a high-speed train, was enough to move a broken machinista past multiple layers of occupation security to a destination he wouldn't recognize until they arrived, a Catholic monastery 15 kilometers inside unoccupied France. The monks who received Henri Baudard asked no questions about his injuries, his identity, or how he'd come to be delivered to their gates wrapped in hay and barely conscious. They simply carried him to their infirmary, where a physician who'd fled Paris after refusing to collaborate with Vichy authorities began the process of trying to save his life. The prognosis was grim. Massive blood loss, internal injuries that required surgery they weren't equipped to perform, and infections that were already setting in from 3 hours of crawling through Belgian mud. The physician gave Baudard perhaps 48 hours to live, maybe 72 if he was extraordinarily lucky, but he'd made it to France. The country that 47 refugees had been trying to reach, the destination that had driven 23 runs and cost him everything, was now the place where Henri Baudard would either recover or die. As consciousness faded again, pulled under by morphine and exhaustion, his last coherent thought was a question he'd never learned the answer to. Had any of them made it? Had a single refugee from that final catastrophic run found safety? Or had his sacrifice, his broken body and destroyed life, purchased nothing but German retribution? The answer to Baudard's question was being written in real time across the Belgian countryside by 77 people who'd scattered into the fog and were now testing whether ordinary civilians could outmaneuver a military occupation force. The 47 refugees, joined by the 30 regular passengers who'd chosen solidarity over safety, had fragmented into small groups of 3 to 5 people, guided by François Dumont's hastily shouted instructions before the German patrols arrived. Some headed north toward farm country, where resistance networks maintained safe houses in barn lofts and root cellars. Others moved south toward the forest regions, where partisan groups operated with increasing boldness. And a desperate few, including the 2 hypothermic brothers and the elderly woman with the broken wrist, attempted the most audacious route, a direct crossing into France through rural areas where the border existed more as a legal concept than a physical barrier. What happened over the next 72 hours would become a case study in how mass escapes either succeed or fail based on factors that have nothing to do with planning or resources. It came down to luck, local knowledge, and the willingness of people who had no obligation to help to make choices that could get them killed. The first group to reach safety consisted of 9 refugees, 2 families, and a university student, who were guided by a Belgian passenger named Claire de Vos, a schoolteacher from Tournai who'd been traveling to visit her sister. De Vos had grown up in the borderlands and knew every farm track, every creek crossing, every place where German patrols rarely ventured because the terrain made vehicle access impossible. She led her group through marshland that soaked them to the waist, across frozen streams that cracked under their weight, and finally to a dairy farm operated by a cousin who took one look at the bedraggled refugees and immediately began preparing food and dry clothing. Within 6 hours of abandoning the train, all 9 were hidden in a false-walled section of the farm's cheese storage cellar, a space that had been constructed specifically for evading German requisition inspections, but now served a far more critical purpose. The farmer, a man named Jules Petit, activated a resistance communication network that stretched from his property to a Franciscan convent in France, and within 36 hours, all 9 refugees had been moved across the border using a route that involved a midnight crossing through a vineyard, whose owner was technically a Vichy collaborator, but secretly despised the Germans enough to risk everything for strangers. The second group wasn't as fortunate. 11 refugees attempting to navigate unfamiliar territory without local guides walked directly into a German mobile patrol operating near the village of Estaimpuis. The Wehrmacht soldiers, still on high alert from the bridge explosion and trained to be suspicious of any nighttime foot traffic, detained the entire group at gunpoint and transported them to a holding facility in Kortrijk for interrogation. But here, something unexpected occurred that revealed how much Baudard's final run had disrupted German operational assumptions. The interrogating Gestapo officer, working from reports that suggested a major resistance action involving trains and explosives, couldn't make the detained refugees fit the narrative. They had no weapons, no explosives, no radio equipment. They were carrying identification papers that were obviously forged, but in ways that suggested amateur work, not professional resistance tradecraft. And most confusing of all, they included children and elderly individuals who made no tactical sense as resistance operatives. The Gestapo officer, a man trained to see conspiracy everywhere, began to suspect he'd captured a different group entirely, perhaps black market smugglers or refugees from a completely separate escape network. In his report, filed 6 hours after the capture, he recommended the prisoners be processed through standard deportation protocols rather than treated as resistance fighters. It was a bureaucratic decision that would save 11 lives, because standard deportation meant transit camps, which meant time, which meant opportunities for rescue that the resistance would eventually exploit. The largest group, 23 refugees traveling with 8 Belgian passengers, implemented the most dangerous strategy. They split into even smaller cells and attempted to blend into local populations until resistance contacts could be activated. This approach worked for some and failed catastrophically for others. A mother and her 2 children were hidden by a butcher in Mouscron, who'd been quietly assisting refugees for months and had developed sophisticated methods for concealing people during German inspections. A pair of young men found shelter with a widow who'd lost her son to German forced labor and channeled her grief into defiance. But 4 refugees, including an elderly couple, were betrayed by a Belgian collaborator who'd been promised a finder's fee for reporting resistance activity. The couple was arrested within 18 hours of leaving the train, subjected to interrogation that revealed nothing because they knew nothing about broader resistance networks, and eventually deported to camps in the east. They would not survive the war. Their betrayer collected his payment, 300 Belgian francs, and continued his work as an informant until 1944, when resistance fighters who'd been tracking his activities executed him in a street that bore the names of people he'd sent to their deaths. But the most remarkable outcome involved the final group of 4 refugees, the 2 hypothermic brothers from the water tank, now being carried by 2 of the regular passengers who decided their business meetings could wait indefinitely compared to the moral imperative of protecting children. This group, led by a businessman named André Moreau who had absolutely no resistance experience, but possessed the kind of stubborn determination that doesn't require training, walked through German checkpoints using a cover story so audacious it bordered on insanity. They claimed to be a family evacuating from Brussels due to British bombing, traveling to stay with relatives in rural France. Moreau forged identity papers using hotel stationery and a typewriter he found in an abandoned farmhouse. The 2 brothers, barely conscious and wrapped in blankets, were presented as his sons suffering from influenza. And somehow, impossibly, the story worked. German checkpoint guards, processing dozens of legitimate evacuees every day and focused on finding armed resistance fighters, waved them through with instructions to seek medical attention for the sick children. By the time Henri Baudart was being carried into the French monastery, those 2 brothers were sitting in a physician's office in Lille, receiving treatment for hypothermia and pneumonia. Their survival a testament to the fact that sometimes the most successful resistance strategy is simply the willingness of ordinary people to lie with absolute conviction. Henri Baudart survived. Against medical predictions, against the odds calculated by physicians who'd seen hundreds of trauma cases, against everything his broken body should have allowed, the machinista who'd jumped from a runaway locomotive lived through the critical 72 hours and began the slow, agonizing process of recovery. The monastery physician, a man named Doctor, Laurent Beaumont, who'd treated enough resistance fighters to recognize the type, watched Baudart's vitals stabilize with something approaching disbelief. The internal bleeding stopped. The infections responded to the limited antibiotics available. The shattered leg, set with medieval simplicity, using splints and prayer, began to heal in a way that would leave Baudart with a permanent limp, but allow him to walk. By the end of January 1942, 6 weeks after the bridge explosion, Baudart was conscious enough to ask the question that had haunted his fever dreams. What happened to the refugees? Dr. Beaumont's answer was incomplete, but contained enough truth to provide fragile hope. Some had made it to France, some had been captured, some were in hiding, their fates unknown. The precision that Baudart craved, the definitive accounting that would tell him whether his sacrifice had been worth the cost, didn't exist. Resistance networks dealt in rumors and partial information, not comprehensive databases. But Beaumont could confirm at least 15 successful crossings, including 2 young brothers who were recovering in Lille, and an elderly woman with a broken wrist who'd been treated at a convent in Tournai before being moved to Switzerland. 15 lives, possibly more. Against how many captured or killed, Beaumont couldn't say. The German investigation into the bridge incident consumed hundreds of man-hours and produced a report that completely missed the truth. Wehrmacht intelligence concluded that the locomotive explosion had been a resistance sabotage operation designed to disrupt border security and create chaos that allowed weapons smuggling. They found no evidence of refugees because they weren't looking for refugees. They were looking for explosives, radio equipment, and military materiel. The passenger cars that had been abandoned on the tracks were examined and found to contain modified compartments, but German analysts interpreted these as smuggling apparatus for black market goods, not human cargo. Henry Baudart was listed as a resistance operative, likely killed in the explosion, and a reward of 5,000 Reichsmarks was offered for information leading to confirmation of his death or capture. His wife and daughters in Liège were questioned extensively, their home searched, their lives placed under surveillance, but they knew nothing, genuinely nothing, because Baudart had never told them what he was doing during those nighttime runs. The Germans eventually concluded the family was innocent and left them under watch but unharmed. Baudart's colleagues, including François Dumont and the railway dispatcher who'd warned him about Kortrijk, were arrested on suspicion of collaboration. Dumont endured 3 weeks of interrogation before being released due to lack of evidence. The dispatcher wasn't as fortunate. He was sent to a labor camp where he'd spend the next 2 years before liberation. The resistance networks that had supported Baudart's operation went underground even deeper, adapting their methods based on lessons learned from the catastrophic final run. The route through Belgium to France was considered compromised and abandoned. New paths were developed through the Netherlands and Switzerland. The use of trains as transport was discontinued in favor of trucks, foot traffic, and in one desperate case, a stolen German military ambulance that moved refugees while pretending to transport wounded Wehrmacht soldiers. Albert Marquet, the man who'd first recruited Baudart, continued his resistance work until 1943, when he was betrayed by an informant and executed by firing squad in Brussels. Before his death, he managed to send a message through the resistance communication network that eventually reached the French monastery where Baudart was recovering. The message was brief. 23 runs, estimated 340 lives saved. The final run added at least 15 more, possibly twice that. You changed everything. They can't erase what you did. Marquet had kept meticulous records, hidden in a dozen different locations, documenting every refugee Baudart had transported across nearly 18 months of operations. Those records would survive the war and eventually be used to calculate the true impact of an ordinary railway worker who decided the rules no longer applied. By April 1942, Baudart was well enough to be moved from the monastery to a resistance safe house in the French countryside, where he'd spend the remainder of the war performing light maintenance work on farm equipment and teaching local resistance members how to sabotage German rail infrastructure without getting caught. His knowledge of railway operations, the systems and procedures that had made his refugee runs possible, now served a different purpose: disrupting German military logistics. He taught partisans where to place charges for maximum damage with minimum explosives, how to disable switches to create delays that looked like mechanical failures, which signals to cut to cause confusion without triggering immediate German response. His leg never fully healed, leaving him dependent on a cane and unable to operate locomotives, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment to resistance never wavered. When Allied forces liberated France in 1944, Baudart was still there, still teaching, still contributing to a war effort that had transformed him from a man who followed rules into a man who understood that some rules deserved to be broken. The final accounting of that December 1941 run would take decades to compile. Researchers working in the 1980s and 90s, combing through resistance archives and survivor testimonies, eventually confirmed that 31 of the 47 refugees aboard Bodart's train reached safety, either immediate crossing into France or survival in hiding until liberation. 11 were captured and deported, with 4 surviving the camps to tell their stories after the war. 5 remained unaccounted for, their fates lost to the chaos of occupation and the incomplete records that define that era. The 30 regular passengers who'd chosen to help rather than remain neutral all survived, though 3 spent time in German detention facilities on suspicion of resistance activity. And Henri Bodart himself lived until 1978, dying in a small village in southern France, where he'd settled after the war, his story largely unknown outside the tight community of resistance historians and Holocaust survivors who understood what he'd accomplished. At his funeral, attended by fewer than 20 people, were 2 men in their late 40s who'd traveled from Israel specifically to pay respects. They were the brothers who'd survived the water tank, the hypothermic children who'd been carried to safety by strangers who became heroes. They never forgot the machinista who'd risked everything to give them a chance at life. Here's what makes Henri Bodart's story so dangerous to forget. He wasn't special. He had no military training, no espionage background, no particular skills that marked him as someone destined for heroism. He was a railway worker who showed up for his shifts, followed the rules, and wanted nothing more than to provide for his family in a world that made sense. But when that world stopped making sense, when the rules themselves became instruments of genocide, Bodart made a choice that millions of people in occupied Europe refused to make. He decided that his comfort, his safety, his very life were less important than the lives of strangers he would never meet again. And that choice, multiplied across 23 runs and approximately 375 saved lives, represents something that modern audiences desperately need to understand. Resistance to evil doesn't require superhuman courage. It requires ordinary people willing to become extraordinary when circumstances demand it. Bodart's story has been largely erased from mainstream World War II history, not because it lacks drama or significance, but because it doesn't fit the comfortable narratives we prefer. We like our Holocaust heroes to be Schindlers, wealthy industrialists with resources and connections. We're less comfortable with the truth that most rescue operations were conducted by people who had nothing except the refusal to comply. The erasure is systematic and revealing. There are no major films about Henri Bodart, no best-selling books, no monuments in Belgium commemorating the machinista who turned his train into a mobile sanctuary. The bridge he destroyed was rebuilt in 1946 and carries traffic to this day, with no plaque explaining what happened there in December 1941. The monastery that saved his life still operates, but doesn't mention his recovery in its historical materials. Even in Israel, where Yad Vashem has honored thousands of righteous Gentiles who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust, Bodart's name appears only in specialized archives accessible to researchers who already know to look for him. This isn't conspiracy. It's the natural result of how history gets written. Grand strategic decisions made by generals and politicians get documented in official records. Individual acts of courage by railway workers get lost in the chaos of war, remembered only by the people directly saved and their descendants. But that loss matters because it creates a distorted picture of what resistance actually looked like. It suggests that fighting evil requires positions of power, when the truth is that some of the most effective resistance came from people whose only power was the willingness to say no. The legacy of that December run extends far beyond the 31 refugees who reached immediate safety. Those survivors had children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who exist today because a Belgian machinista jumped from a runaway locomotive into darkness. Genealogical research conducted in 2012 estimated that Bodart's total rescue operations across all 23 runs had resulted in approximately 1,800 living descendants as of that year. Teachers, physicians, artists, engineers, Parents raising the next generation with stories about a man named Henri, who'd saved their great-grandmother in a modified train compartment. But the legacy runs deeper than biology. Every single regular passenger who chose to help refugees escape rather than protect themselves by staying silent became part of a resistance network they hadn't known existed hours earlier. Some continued that work throughout the occupation. Others returned to normal life but carried the knowledge that they'd faced a moral test and passed it. That knowledge, that proof of their own capacity for courage, changed how they navigated every subsequent crisis in their lives. The ripple effects of one man's decision to modify a passenger train cannot be fully calculated, but they're still propagating through time, still shaping the world in ways both visible and invisible. Modern railway workers in Belgium and France occasionally encounter stories about Bodart through union historical societies or local museums, and some have started asking questions that make contemporary institutions uncomfortable. If an ordinary machinista could save hundreds of lives by creatively using the tools of his trade, what responsibility do today's transportation workers have when they encounter modern injustices? When trains are used to deport asylum seekers, when railway systems facilitate policies that separate families or enforce discriminatory border controls, does Bodart's example suggest that following orders isn't sufficient justification? These aren't abstract questions. They're being asked right now by people who operate the same rail lines Bodart used, who work in systems that still prioritize efficiency and compliance over moral evaluation of outcomes. The discomfort those questions create is precisely why Bodart's story remains marginalized. It's not safely historical, it's dangerously applicable. It suggests that ordinary people in ordinary jobs have both the capacity and perhaps the obligation to resist when their professional tools are being used to facilitate harm, and institutions, whether governmental or corporate, vastly prefer narratives that don't encourage employees to make independent moral judgments about orders. So Henri Bodart remains hidden in the historical record, known to specialists and descendants, but absent from the mainstream consciousness that shapes how we understand resistance, heroism, and moral responsibility. His modified passenger train, his 23 runs, his final desperate gamble that saved at least 15 lives at the cost of his own mobility and security, these aren't taught in schools, aren't featured in documentaries, aren't referenced when politicians invoke the lessons of World War II, but they should be, because Bodart's real achievement wasn't the specific number of people he saved, impressive as that number is. His achievement was demonstrating that the apparatus of oppression, the trains and bureaucracies and systems that enable atrocity, can be turned against themselves by individuals who understand those systems well enough to exploit them. He proved that you don't need to overthrow the entire regime to save lives. You just need to know where the false floors can be installed, which routes the inspectors ignore, and when to jump from a runaway locomotive because your death might buy someone else time to escape. That's the story they don't teach. That's the machinista who history tried to forget. And that's exactly why his name deserves to be remembered now. In a world that still runs on trains, still depends on ordinary people following orders, and still desperately needs examples of what happens when someone decides the rules no longer apply.